If someone starts calling you defective, it only means they've already decided you're replaceable. The thought came uninvited, sharp and clean, as Evan Reed stood just outside the half-closed door of the private suite, the muted glow of warm light spilling into the hallway while voices slipped through the narrow gap without resistance. His pheromone system is unstable, Derek Vaughn said from inside, his tone even, detached, like he was discussing a malfunctioning asset instead of a person. It's deteriorating faster than expected. Another voice answered, quieter, cautious. And you're still maintaining the arrangement? There was a brief pause, the faint sound of ice shifting in a glass. Then Derek exhaled softly, almost bored. For now, he said. Until it stops being practical. A beat, then lower, colder. Honestly, it's becoming unpleasant. Evan didn't move, didn't react, didn't allow even a flicker of emotion to surface, because none of it was new. Not really. It was simply the first time Derek had said it out loud, and somehow that made it easier to accept, easier to finalize. A slow breath left Evan's lungs as a familiar heat began to build beneath his skin, subtle at first, then tightening, spreading with quiet insistence through his system. The pain followed seconds later, sharp and needling, like pressure building from the inside out. His fingers pressed briefly against the wall beside him, grounding himself through it. The doctor's warning echoed somewhere in the back of his mind. No suppressants. Not anymore. Each dose would only make the damage worse. Without alpha pheromones, the condition would escalate. Unpredictably. Dangerously. But even that thought felt distant now. Secondary. Inside the room, Derek continued speaking, but Evan had already turned away. The conversation no longer relevant. His steps measured as he moved down the hallway. Posture straight. Expression composed. As if nothing had shifted at all, as if everything hadn't just aligned perfectly into a single, simple conclusion. Mr. Reed. Kevin's voice cut in as he hurried. Over. Eyes scanning Evan quickly, sharp and alert. You don't look well, he added, lowering his voice. Then glancing toward the suite with visible irritation. Was that him? Evan stopped, the heat inside him rising another degree, but his voice remained steady, controlled. It doesn't matter, he said. Kevin frowned immediately, frustration surfacing. It matters if he's talking about you like that, he snapped, fists tightening. I'll go in there right now. No. Evan interrupted, calm, final, and Kevin froze mid-step. That's unnecessary. Evan continued. Kevin stared at him, confused now. Unnecessary? He's irrelevant. Evan said quietly, and that single word shifted something. The anger in Kevin's expression faltering as he tried to read Evan's face and found nothing there. No anger, no hurt, no hesitation. The silence stretched just long enough for the heat in Evan's body to spike again, sharper this time, forcing him to shift his weight slightly. Kevin noticed instantly, concern replacing frustration. You're not okay, he said, more serious now. We need to get you something? Suppressants or no suppressants? Evan cut in without hesitation. Kevin paused, recalculating quickly, then nodded. Then I'll find you an alpha, he said, decisive. Someone better than him. Evan opened his mouth automatically, the correction forming out of habit. No, just medication. But the words stopped before they could leave. Derek's voice echoed again in his mind, calm, dismissive, clinical. And just like that, the equation simplified. If Derek found him unsuitable, then there was no reason to continue the arrangement. No reason to maintain something that had always been transactional, never personal. Evan closed his mouth, the correction dissolving, and said instead, do what you need to do. Kevin blinked, surprised, but nodded immediately, determination snapping back into place. I'll handle it, he said before turning and disappearing down the corridor. The hallway quieted again, and for a moment Evan stood still, the heat in his body rising steadily, controlled but dangerous. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out his phone, movements precise, deliberate. The screen lit up, Derek's name exactly where it had always been, unchanged, unimportant now. Evan tapped into the conversation and typed without hesitation, we're done. The arrangement ends tonight. He read it once, not to reconsider but to confirm, logic aligned, obligation fulfilled, no loose ends. Then pressed send. The message delivered instantly, the scene indicator appearing almost immediately after. Evan watched it for exactly 1 second, then locked the screen and put the phone away. Whatever Derek chose to do with that message was no longer his concern. Contract fulfilled. Way that looked unintentional but deliberate enough to contrast the precision of Evan's own appearance, his eyes sharp, observant, not once dropping to scan or evaluate in the way most alphas did, not measuring, not judging, just reading, not flashy, not arrogant, not looking at me like I'm broken. The heat inside Evan shifted again, but this time it wasn't just instability. There was a point of focus now, something grounding, something compatible. The man tilted his head slightly, still watching him, then said, calm and direct, "If you're looking for an alpha, you should consider me." The words landed without pressure, without demand, confident, but not imposing. Evan didn't respond immediately, instead studying him one last time, measuring, calculating. Not just capability but preference, alignment, control. He fits. Evan exhaled slowly, the decision forming cleanly, without hesitation. "Fine," he said. Lucas didn't hesitate. The moment Evan said fine, the air between them shifted, the distance collapsing in a way that felt less like a choice and more like inevitability, his hand returning to Evan's arm. Not forceful, not rough, just firm enough to steady, to anchor. And the effect was immediate, the sharp instability inside Evan easing just slightly, enough for him to notice the difference. Lucas tilted his head, studying him with that same quiet focus, then said, almost casually, "You always make decisions this fast." Evan met his gaze without flinching. "Only when they're obvious." Lucas's mouth curved faintly, something amused flickering there. "Good," he said, stepping just a fraction closer. "I'd hate to be a bad investment." The word choice didn't go unnoticed, and for a split second Evan's mind categorized him. Clean appearance, controlled presence, confidence without arrogance, no visible hesitation, high-end, discreet, likely used to situations like this. So that's what this is, Evan thought. Not unexpected, not unacceptable, just efficient. Lucas didn't rush him, didn't crowd him, but the proximity alone was enough. The steady presence, the precise control in the way he adjusted his distance, as if he knew exactly how much was needed and nothing more. And that, more than anything, was what set him apart. Evan exhaled slowly, the tight pressure in his system loosening, not gone, but manageable now, and Lucas noticed, of course he did, his voice dropping just slightly, not intimate, not invasive, just closer, better. Evan didn't answer right away, his eyes narrowing a fraction as he studied him again, recalculating, then said, "You're effective." Lucas let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. "That's a low bar," he said. "You don't sound impressed." Evan's expression didn't change. "I don't need to be," he replied, and for a moment something sharper flashed in Lucas's eyes. Interest, not offense. The rest of the night blurred in a way that felt strangely controlled, not chaotic, not overwhelming, just aligned. Every movement measured, every shift in proximity deliberate, the heat inside Evan stabilizing steadily under Lucas's quiet control. No excess, no unnecessary pressure, just precision. And that alone told Evan everything he needed to know. By the time the tension in his system had fully leveled out, the decision was already made. Not emotional, not impulsive, just logical. When Evan finally stepped back, putting a deliberate inch of space between them, his gaze swept over Lucas one last time, evaluating, concluding, "You're better than I expected," he said, and Lucas's lips twitched. "You didn't expect much." Evan adjusted his sleeve, smooth, composed. "I didn't need to." The answer landed cleanly, without room for interpretation. Morning came quietly, sunlight cutting through the edge of the curtains in a narrow strip across the room. Evan was awake before it fully reached him. His mind clear, his body steady for the first time in days. He sat up slowly, already cataloging the difference. No instability, no sharp edge under his skin, just a controlled baseline. And that alone confirmed the decision. Across the room, Lucas was already awake, leaning back slightly, posture relaxed in a way that suggested he'd never really been off guard to begin with. His gaze flicked toward Evan the moment he moved, alert but unbothered. "Morning," he said, voice low, easy, like this was routine. Evan didn't respond immediately, instead reaching for his watch, checking the time with a quick glance before looking back at him. "You stayed," he said, not a question. Lucas tilted his head slightly. "You didn't tell me to leave," he replied, just as easily. Then after a beat, added with a hint of amusement, Should I have? Evan ignored that, already shifting into decision mode. You were effective, he repeated, tone unchanged. Lucas smiled faintly. Still not the same as satisfied, he said, and this time there was something more deliberate in the way he said it. A light edge of teasing that didn't cross into anything inappropriate, but lingered just enough to be noticed. Evan watched him for a second, then said flatly, "It's the only metric that matters." Lucas huffed out a quiet breath, shaking his head once. "You're hard to please," he said. "I'm not here to be pleased," Evan replied, and that ended that. There was a short pause before Lucas leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms against his knees, his gaze steady. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Was that a one-time thing, or do I get to stay?" The phrasing was casual, but the question wasn't, and Evan recognized that immediately. He considered it for exactly 2 seconds, running through the same checklist as before: stability, control, discretion, compatibility. Then said, "You can stay." No hesitation, no negotiation, just a decision. Lucas's expression didn't change much, but there was a subtle shift there, something satisfied, something quieter. "Good," he said simply. Evan reached for his phone then. Finally, the screen lighting up to reveal a flood of missed calls and messages, all from one contact, Derek Vaughn. The preview alone was enough. "Where are you? Answer your phone. We need to talk." Each message more direct than the last, more insistent, and for a moment Evan just looked at it. Expression unreadable. Then the phone vibrated again in his hand, the name flashing across the screen. He answered without delay, lifting it to his ear. "Yes." Derek's voice came through immediately, sharp, controlled, but there was something under it now, something tighter than before. "We need to meet." No greeting, no pretense. Evan didn't bother asking why, didn't ask when, didn't ask anything at all. "Fine," he said, tone even, already disengaged, and ended the call before Derek could add anything else. He lowered the phone slowly, his gaze shifting back to Lucas, who had been watching the entire exchange without interruption, without comment. "Something I should know?" Lucas asked lightly. Evan slid the phone back into his pocket, expression calm, composed. "No," he said, then after a brief pause, added, "Not yet." And that was the only answer he gave. "You're really going to see him?" Lucas's voice wasn't loud, but there was something sharper underneath it now, a subtle edge that hadn't been there before, and it stopped Evan mid-step just as he reached for his coat. Evan didn't turn immediately, fastening his cuff with the same calm precision as always before glancing over his shoulder. "Yes," he said simply, as if the answer required no further discussion. But Lucas pushed off the edge of the table and closed the distance in 2 easy steps, his expression no longer amused, no longer teasing. "You want to go see that bastard after what he said about you?" The words came out low, controlled, but unmistakably irritated. Evan's gaze narrowed slightly, not offended, but assessing. "That's not your concern," he replied, tone even, and that only seemed to irritate Lucas more, his jaw tightening just slightly. "Not my concern," he echoed, then let out a quiet breath through his nose, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Right," he said. "Of course it isn't." There was a brief pause before he added, softer but more pointed, "You're just going to meet him like nothing happened?" Evan turned fully this time, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm going to meet him to make things clear," he said. "That's all." Lucas held his eyes for a second longer, searching, then scoffed lightly. "Make things clear," he repeated. "You already ended it." His tone dipped again, quieter, but carrying that same restrained frustration. "Or are you planning to take it back?" Evan's expression cooled a fraction, the air between them tightening. "You're overstepping," he said, not harsh, but firm enough to draw a line. And for a split second Lucas didn't respond, something unreadable flickering across his face before it smoothed out just as quickly, the irritation gone as if it had never been there, replaced by something lighter, almost playful. "Am I?" he said, tilting his head slightly, the corner of his mouth lifting again. "Then consider this my last attempt." And before Evan could respond, Lucas stepped in closer, close enough that the space between them disappeared entirely, his presence suddenly overwhelming in a way that was precise rather than forceful, his voice dropping just enough to shift the tone. "You're going to be late," he murmured, and yet he made no move to step aside. Evan inhaled slowly, aware of exactly what Lucas was doing, aware of how easily he could disengage and leave, and yet, He didn't, because the effect was immediate. The steady control Lucas carried settling over him again, grounding, stabilizing, making the tension in his system ease in a way that was difficult to ignore. Move, Evans said, but there was less edge in it now, less urgency, and Lucas noticed that too. Of course he did, his expression softening just enough to look almost satisfied. In a minute, he replied, and that minute stretched. Then another, time slipping in a way that felt deliberate, controlled, until the clock on the wall was suddenly an hour ahead of where it should have been. When Evan finally stepped back, putting space between them. Again, his expression had returned to its usual calm, but there was a faint flush at the edge of his composure, subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice. Lucas did, and the small smile that followed said he knew exactly what it meant. Now you're definitely late, he said lightly. Evan picked up his coat without responding, slipping it on with smooth efficiency. That's fine, he said, tone flat, already moving toward the door. And this time Lucas didn't stop him, only watching as he left. The hint of something thoughtful lingering in his gaze. By the time Evan arrived, he was exactly 53 minutes behind schedule, the conference room already half empty, the atmosphere tight with the tail end of a meeting. Derek Vaughn stood near the head of the table, sleeves rolled slightly, expression sharp as he checked his watch the moment Evan stepped inside. You're late, Derek said immediately. No greeting, no acknowledgement beyond that, his voice carrying that same controlled authority. I don't wait. Evan closed the door behind him, unbothered. Then don't, he replied. And the simplicity of the response seemed to catch Derek off guard for half a second before his expression hardened. Is this supposed to be some kind of tactic? Derek asked, stepping closer, his tone lowering but no less pointed. Ignoring my calls, sending that message, showing up late. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied Evan. What exactly are you trying to do? Get my attention? Evan met his gaze without hesitation, completely still, completely composed. No, he said. I ended the arrangement. Derek let out a short, humorless breath, something between a scoff and a laugh. You ended it, he repeated, as if the idea itself was mildly absurd. You don't end something like this on a whim, his voice sharpened slightly. If this is your way of playing hard to get, it's not, Evan cut in, calm but final. There's nothing to get. The words landed cleanly, without emotion, without provocation, and that seemed to irritate Derek more than anything else. For a moment he just looked at Evan, as if expecting something else to follow, some crack, some sign that this was temporary, a reaction he could work with. But there was nothing, just the same steady gaze, unchanged. A knock came at the door then, one of Derek's associates stepping in with a quiet, "They're waiting." Derek glanced toward the door, annoyance flickering briefly before he looked back at Evan. This isn't finished, he said, tone clipped. Go home, he added, already turning away. I'll deal with this later. The assumption was clear, the confidence unshaken, as if Evan's words hadn't mattered at all, as if this was nothing more than a minor inconvenience he would resolve when it suited him. Evan watched him for exactly 1 second, then turned and left without another word, because there was nothing to explain, nothing to argue, nothing to prove. The decision had already been made. Outside, the air was cooler, sharper, and for the first time since entering the building, Evan exhaled fully, the tension settling back into something manageable. His phone buzzed in his pocket as he stepped onto the sidewalk, and this time when he pulled it out, the name on the screen was different. Lucas. Did it go well? A second message followed almost immediately. Hey, try not to miss me too much. I'm very hard to replace. Then another, a photo attached, Lucas's face filling the frame, slightly angled, sunlight catching the edge of his features, relaxed, confident, and just a little too aware of how he looked, the kind of image that wasn't trying too hard and yet still landed exactly where it was meant to. Evan stared at it for a second longer than necessary, then noticed the rest of it. The casual positioning, the clean lines of his posture, the effortless balance between composed and unguarded, and without warning, the memory of the previous night surfaced, sharp and immediate, the controlled proximity, the steady presence, the way everything had aligned so precisely. A faint warmth crept up along the edge of Evan's expression before he caught it, subtle, brief, but there, and just for a moment, the corner of his mouth lifted, almost imperceptibly, before he typed back. It was handled, and slipped the phone back into his pocket, continuing down the street like nothing had changed, even though, Somewhere beneath the surface, something already had. You're staring again, Lucas said without looking up, the corner of his mouth lifting as he slid a cup of coffee across the small cafe table, sunlight catching in his hair in a way that felt annoyingly deliberate, like he knew exactly what he was doing. Evan didn't deny it, taking the cup with a measured calm. You chose a place within walking distance of a university, he said instead, gaze flicking briefly to the students passing by outside, then back to Lucas. I assumed it was intentional. Lucas finally looked up, eyes bright, amused. It was, he said, convenient. Evan's fingers paused slightly around the cup, a detail so small most people wouldn't notice. For what? He asked, tone neutral. Lucas leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms lazily as if the answer was obvious. Classes, he said. And just like that, the entire equation shifted. Evan stared at him for a beat longer than necessary, recalibrating. You're a student, he said, not a question. Lucas tilted his head, watching him closely now. You didn't know? He asked, the teasing edge returning. I thought you had me fully evaluated by now. Evan set the cup down with deliberate care. You presented yourself as something else, he said. Lucas's expression shifted immediately, a flash of something sharper passing through his eyes. Something else, he repeated, quieter now, then leaned forward, resting his chin lightly on his hand. Let me guess, he added, voice dropping just enough to carry weight. You thought I was for hire. Evan didn't respond, which was answer enough. Lucas exhaled, a short, incredulous laugh escaping him before he shook his head. Do I look like a prostitute to you? He asked, not offended exactly, but clearly not pleased either. Evan's gaze remained steady. You were effective, he said, as if that justified the assumption. Lucas stared at him for a second, then scoffed. Unbelievable, he muttered, leaning back again, one hand dragging through his hair in frustration. Do you have any idea how insane that sounds? Evan didn't flinch. You approached me in a private club and offered exactly what I needed, he said, calm, logical. The conclusion was reasonable. Lucas let out another breath, shaking his head, but this time there was something almost fond under the irritation. You're unbelievable, he said again, softer now. Then after a pause, his gaze sharpened, locking onto Evan's. So now that you know I'm not for hire, he continued, what's your excuse? Evan's brows drew together slightly. Excuse. Lucas leaned forward again, closer this time, his voice lowering just enough to shift the air between them. Yeah, he said, for not taking this seriously. Evan's expression cooled a fraction. You're 20, he said simply. Lucas didn't even blink, and, he asked. Evan held his gaze. Unyielding. This, he gestured vaguely between them, is temporary. Lucas's jaw tightened just slightly. You don't get to decide that alone, he said. And there it was again, that edge, that refusal to simply accept Evan's conclusions. People like you. Evan continued, tone even, burn fast, and then move on. Lucas's eyes darkened a fraction. People like me, he repeated, then leaned in closer. Close enough that Evan could feel the shift in presence again, controlled, deliberate. You don't know anything about people like me, he said quietly. Evan opened his mouth to respond, but Lucas was faster this time, closing the distance just enough to cut him off. Not forceful, not abrupt, just enough to stop the words before they could form, and for a second Evan stilled, not because he couldn't move, but because he chose not to. The moment stretched, tension coiling tight between them. Then Lucas pulled back, just slightly, just enough to meet his eyes again. You talk too much. When you're wrong, he murmured, and before Evan could re-establish distance, Lucas shifted again, pulling him back into that same controlled proximity that made everything else blur at the edges, time slipping in quiet increments, deliberate, consuming, until resistance felt less like logic and more like habit, and even that began to fade. When it ended, it wasn't abrupt, just a gradual easing, the tension settling into something quieter, steadier, Evan's eyes closing briefly as the last of the strain left his system, exhaustion finally catching up with him. And this time he didn't fight it, his head tilting slightly as he drifted, the world narrowing down to nothing. Lucas didn't move for a moment, just watching him, something softer settling into his expression now, something unguarded, his hand lifting slowly, almost hesitantly, brushing a strand of hair back from Evan's forehead before leaning in just enough to press a light kiss there, lingering for a fraction longer then. Necessary. Idiot, he murmured under his breath, voice barely audible. Who told you this was temporary? His gaze traced over Evan's features, memorizing, steady. I've been watching you for 5 years, he added. Quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them, and for once, there was no one there to hear them. Morning came with the soft clatter of dishes and the faint scent of coffee. Evan stirred slowly, awareness returning in layers. The first thing he noticed was the absence of tension in his body. The second was the warmth near him, and when he opened his eyes, Lucas was already there, setting a tray down on the bedside table. You're awake, he said lightly, like this was routine, like this was normal. Evan pushed himself up slightly, gaze flicking to the tray, then back to Lucas. You cook, he said. Lucas grinned. Among other things, he replied, then stepped closer without hesitation, hands settling at Evan's waist with easy familiarity. You look stiff, he added, and before Evan could object, his touch shifted, firm but careful, easing the tension from muscles that had been tight without him noticing. The movement efficient, practiced. You don't have to do that, Evan said, but there was no real resistance behind it. Lucas hummed softly, not stopping. I know, he said. I want to. The answer landed differently, simple, unforced, and Evan didn't respond. Just let the moment settle. By the time he was dressed and ready to leave, Lucas was already by the door, leaning casually against the frame, watching him with that same steady attention. You'll come back later? He asked, tone light but eyes intent. Evan adjusted his sleeve, glancing at him briefly. I'll pick you up after work, he said, and Lucas's smile widened instantly, bright, unguarded. I'll hold you to that, he replied. The office felt colder in comparison, sharper, the shift immediate the moment Evan stepped inside. Kevin appeared at his side almost instantly, expression tense. He's here, he said quietly. Evan didn't need to ask who. Let him in, he said, already moving toward his office. The door hadn't even fully closed behind him before it opened again. Derek Vaughn stepping in, with a controlled kind of anger, the kind that had been building long enough to sharpen into something precise. You blocked me, Derek said immediately, no preamble, his voice low. Dangerous, Evan took his seat without looking up. Yes, he replied simply. Derek stared at him, incredulous. On every platform, he added, as if that made it worse. Evan finally looked up, expression calm, detached. Then it was effective, he said, and for a moment Derek just stood there, as if trying to process the fact that none of this was going the way he expected. What exactly do you think you're doing? He demanded, stepping closer. Ending something that no longer exists, Evan said, just as evenly. Derek's expression darkened. You don't get to make that decision alone, he snapped. Evan leaned back slightly in his chair, unbothered. I already did, he said. Derek's eyes narrowed, something colder settling in now. If this is some kind of stunt, he said slowly, I can have your grandfather reconsider his investments by the end of the week. The threat hung in the air, heavy, deliberate, and Evan didn't react, not even slightly. Do what you need to do, he said, tone unchanged, then pressed the intercom button without looking away. Kevin, he added, please escort Mr. Vaughn out. The door opened almost immediately, Kevin stepping in, expression carefully neutral. Derek didn't move at first, his gaze locked on Evan, searching for something, anything that suggested this wasn't real, but there was nothing, just the same steady calm, unshaken, and after a long second, he turned sharply and walked out without another word. The door closed behind him, and the room fell quiet. Again, the tension dissipating as quickly as it had come. Evan leaned back slightly, exhaling once, controlled, then reached for his phone, the screen lighting up with a new message. Lucas, don't forget your promise. I'm waiting. And this time, whether he meant to or not, Evan smiled. You didn't tell me you lived somewhere like this, Evan said quietly, his voice carrying through the phone as he eased the car down into the underground garage, the polished concrete reflecting clean white light, every detail precise, controlled, expensive in a way that didn't need to announce itself. On the other end, Lucas let out a soft laugh, warm and unbothered. You didn't ask, he replied, and Evan could practically hear the smile in his voice. You're here? He added, tone shifting just slightly, more attentive now. Evan parked, cutting the engine as his gaze swept the space automatically. Security cameras, restricted access points, The kind of place that filtered people before they even stepped inside. I just got down to the garage, he said, stepping out and closing the door with a quiet click. You could have warned me. Lucas hummed softly. Would it have changed anything? Evan paused for half a second, then continued walking, phone still at his ear. No, he admitted, and Lucas's voice softened, amused. Then I made the right call. There was a brief silence before Lucas added, lighter this time. Take the elevator on the left, The sharp sound of another car pulling in cut through the space. Tires stopping just a little too fast, footsteps following immediately after, deliberate. Familiar. Evan didn't need to turn, his expression already cooling as the voice came from behind him. Following me now. Derek Vaughn's tone carried that same misplaced confidence, as if nothing had changed, as if everything was still under his control. I was wondering how long it would take. Evan didn't respond right away, his grip on the phone steady. Lucas's voice came through faintly. Evan. But Evan's attention had already shifted. Derek stepped closer, stopping just behind him, arms loosely crossed, posture relaxed in a way that was clearly intentional. Couldn't handle it, he continued, a faint smirk in his voice. Had to come all the way here just to see me? Evan finally turned, slow, deliberate, his gaze landing on Derek without any trace of emotion. You're mistaken, he said simply. There was a brief pause, just long enough for the words to settle. But Derek only scoffed, shaking his head slightly. Still pretending, he said. Fine. His tone shifted, softening just enough to sound almost indulgent. If you're here to apologize, I might consider it, he added, glancing down briefly before looking back at Evan. Go ahead. The implication was clear. Evan said nothing, and that silence only seemed to reinforce Derek's confidence, his chin lifting slightly as he waited, expecting, assuming. On the phone, Lucas's voice cut in again, sharper this time. Who is that? Evan didn't answer him yet, his gaze still fixed on Derek as he stepped forward just enough to close the space between them, his voice calm, almost bored. Move, he said. Derek blinked, caught off guard for a fraction of a second before irritation flickered across his face. You really think you can? Being near you is unpleasant. Evan cut in, tone unchanged, but colder now. Final. Move. The words landed clean, without force, without volume, but something in them shifted the air, and for the first time, Derek hesitated. Evan stepped past him without another glance, dismissing him completely, and that, more than anything, broke Derek's composure. You don't walk away from me, he snapped, reaching out to grab Evan's arm. The reaction was immediate, instinctive. Evan pivoted smoothly, catching Derek's wrist mid-motion, his grip precise, controlled, twisting just enough to force him off balance. The movement efficient, practiced. Derek stumbled forward, a sharp breath escaping him. As the pressure increased, Evan's voice remained even, almost conversational. You should be more careful, he said, adjusting his hold just slightly before releasing him in one clean motion, stepping back as if nothing had happened. What the hell? Derek hissed, clutching his arm, anger flashing through his expression. But there was something else there now, something less certain. Evan adjusted his sleeve, unhurried. I forgot to mention, he said, glancing at him briefly. I have a black belt. The words delivered as if they carried no weight at all. Derek straightened, face flushing with a mix of anger and humiliation. This isn't over, he snapped, voice rising. I can end every contract your company has by tomorrow, he added, the threat sharp, desperate. I'll make sure you don't have anywhere left to stand. Evan turned back toward the elevator, pressing the button without looking at him. Do what you need to do, he said over his shoulder, the same calm indifference as before. Behind him, Derek's voice rose again, louder now, edged with frustration. And don't forget what I gave you, he called out. You think you get to keep those? The elevator door slid open with a soft chime. Evan stepped inside, the noise cutting off as the doors began to close, Derek's voice fading into the narrowing gap. Only then did Evan lift the phone back to his ear, Lucas's voice immediately coming through, low and tense. Evan. Evan leaned back slightly against the mirrored wall as the elevator began its smooth ascent, his reflection staring back at him, composed as ever. I'm fine, he said. There was a pause on the other end. Then Lucas exhaled slowly, the tension easing just slightly. That sounded like him, he said, quieter now. Evan's gaze flicked briefly to the floor indicator, then back to his reflection. It was, he replied. Another pause, then softer, almost reluctant. Did he touch you? Evan's expression didn't change, but there was the faintest shift in his tone, something almost dismissive. He tried, he said. It didn't go well for him. Lucas let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh, something relieved, something darker underneath. Good, he said. Then after a beat, lighter again. Next time, let me handle it. Evan's lips curved just slightly, barely there. Unnecessary, he said. And this time Lucas laughed properly. The sound warmed through the line. You're impossible, he said. But you're still coming up, right? Evan glanced at the numbers ticking higher, the steady hum of the elevator filling the silence for a second. I said I would, he replied, and Lucas's voice softened again, that familiar warmth settling back in. Good, he said. I've been waiting. 6. You kept him waiting long enough, Derek said, the satisfaction barely concealed in his voice as Evan stepped into the sitting room, the heavy wooden doors closing quietly behind him, sealing off the space. The room itself was deliberately traditional. Dark wood, low lighting, the faint scent of aged tea leaves. Everything arranged to remind visitors exactly whose territory they were standing in. Evan didn't respond to Derek, his gaze already shifting past him to the older man seated at the center, posture relaxed, expression composed, the kind of calm that came from decades of power rather than the need to display it. Evan, the old man greeted, his tone warm, almost welcoming, as if this were a casual visit rather than a summons. Come, sit. Evan inclined his head slightly, polite, controlled, and took the seat across from him without hesitation. Derek remained standing off to the side, arms crossed, the faint curve of his lips betraying his anticipation. I've heard, the old man began, pouring tea with steady hands, that the two of you have been having some disagreements. He slid the cup toward Evan, his eyes sharp despite the softness in his tone. Did Derek do something to upset you? The question was phrased gently, but it carried weight, an invitation rather than an accusation. Evan accepted the cup with both hands, posture straight, voice even. No, sir, he said. We simply realized we're not compatible, he continued, meeting the older man's gaze calmly. I've already made it clear to Derek that we've ended things. But it seems there's been some misunderstanding. A brief pause, then added, I apologize for not informing you directly. The old man studied him for a moment, then let out a soft sigh, shaking his head slightly. Young people, he murmured, so quick to begin, and just as quick to end. He took a slow sip of his tea before continuing. You understand, of course, that your engagement wasn't just a personal matter. His eyes lifted again, sharper now, more deliberate. It represented cooperation between our two families. Evan inclined his head again, acknowledging. I understand, he said simply. The old man set his cup down with quiet precision, his expression unchanged, but the tone beneath his words shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible. Back then, he continued, we made certain concessions out of respect for the relationship between our families. His gaze lingered just slightly, accepting an omega with certain limitations. The phrasing was polite, but the meaning wasn't softened in the slightest. Derek's smirk deepened at the side, clearly pleased with the direction of the conversation. Evan's expression didn't change, not a flicker, not a reaction, just the same calm composure as before, as if the words held no weight at all. If you are dissatisfied with this arrangement, the old man went on, folding his hands loosely in front of him, then unfortunately, we will have to consider alternative partnerships. The implication settled into the room like a final note, quiet but decisive. Evan lowered his gaze briefly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, then looked back up, steady, unshaken. Of course, he said. I understand and accept that. His tone remained respectful, measured, without a trace of resistance. Derek let out a soft breath, something almost triumphant slipping into his expression, as if everything had unfolded exactly as he expected, as if this was the moment Evan would finally realize what he was losing. But Evan didn't look at him, didn't react, didn't shift even slightly. For a brief second, the room settled into silence. The old man watching Evan carefully, as if measuring something beyond the words spoken, something deeper. And then, who said anything about ending the partnership? The voice cut in from the doorway, clear, steady, and unmistakably familiar. The shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable, the air in the room tightening as all attention turned toward the entrance. Derek's expression faltered first, confusion flickering across his face before irritation followed. "What are you?" he started, but didn't finish. Evan didn't turn right away, but the faintest pause in his breathing gave him away. Just for a fraction of a second, the old man's eyes narrowed slightly, interest sharpening as he looked past Evan toward the figure now standing at the threshold. And for the first time since Evan had entered the room, the balance of the conversation shifted. "Elle, what are you doing here?" Evan's voice was the only thing that moved in the room for a split second, low and controlled, but carrying a rare note of genuine surprise as he turned toward the doorway. And that was when Lucas moved. He didn't hesitate, didn't acknowledge the tension, didn't even look at Derek, crossing the room in a few quick steps before pulling Evan into a familiar, easy embrace, one arm wrapping around his waist like it belonged there, natural, practiced. "You're the one who showed up at my place without telling me," Lucas said lightly, his tone warm, almost playful, completely at odds with the frozen silence around them. "Shouldn't I be the one asking questions?" Evan went still for a fraction of a second, not resisting, but clearly recalculating, his gaze flicking briefly to the older man, then back to Lucas. The shift in the room was immediate, Derek's expression snapping from smug confidence to something far sharper, disbelief flashing across his face, while the old man's calm demeanor cracked just enough to show genuine surprise. "You two know each other?" he asked, his voice slower now, more deliberate. Derek let out a short, incredulous laugh, the sound edged with anger. "Know each other," he repeated, stepping forward, his composure finally breaking. "He's my fiancé," he snapped, pointing toward Evan before his gaze swung to Lucas, fury rising unchecked. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Lucas didn't let go of Evan. If anything, his hold tightened slightly, his posture relaxed, unbothered, his head tilting just enough to glance at Derek with faint amusement. "Correction," he said calmly. "Your ex." Derek's face flushed instantly, the words hitting harder than expected. "You think this is funny?" he demanded, his voice rising. "You go behind my back and steal." He stopped himself just short, jaw clenching, then spat out. "You're unbelievable." His gaze darkened, shifting fully onto Lucas now. "I should have known," he said, voice low, venomous, "always lurking around like you belonged, acting like you were better than everyone else." His lips curled. "You're nothing but a bastard who doesn't know his place." The insult landed sharp, deliberate. Lucas's expression didn't change, the smile still there, but colder now, edged with something quieter, more dangerous. "Careful," he said softly. "You're starting to sound emotional." Derek took another step forward, clearly losing whatever control he had left. "You think you can just take what's mine?" he snapped. "He was never yours." Lucas cut in, just as calm, just as certain, and this time the room went completely still. The old man's eyes narrowed slightly, watching the exchange with renewed interest, while Evan remained silent between them, his expression unreadable, though the faintest tension had returned to his posture. Lucas shifted his attention then, turning slightly toward the older man, his tone softening instantly, the edge disappearing as if it had never been there. "Grandfather," he said, the word landing cleanly, confidently. "I was actually planning to introduce him to you properly," he added, pulling Evan just slightly closer in a way that was unmistakably intentional. "This is my partner." The phrasing was simple, direct, and for the first time, the older man's composure faltered more visibly, his gaze moving between them, recalculating, reassessing. Derek let out a harsh laugh, disbelief bleeding into anger. "You've got to be kidding me," he said, shaking his head. "You think you can just, what, rewrite everything?" His voice sharpened. "He's engaged to me." Lucas's eyes flicked back to him, calm, steady. "He ended it," he said, "immediately after you decided to humiliate him in public." The words were quiet, but they landed with precision, each one deliberate. Derek froze for a fraction of a second, caught off guard. Then his expression twisted again. "That's not." "It is." Lucas cut him off, still calm, still composed. "You made it very clear what you thought of him," he added, his gaze steady now, unwavering. "So don't pretend this is a misunderstanding." The silence that followed was heavier this time, Derek's anger colliding with something less certain, something he hadn't prepared for. Lucas exhaled lightly, then shifted again, his tone softening as he turned back toward Evan, The change immediate, almost seamless. If it's not your family, he said, voice lighter now, almost teasing, then it'll just be mine. His arm tightened slightly around Evan's waist, casual but deliberate. We'll proceed with everything as planned, he added, glancing back toward the older man. Right, grandfather? The question was phrased politely, but there was no hesitation behind it. Evan, who had remained silent through most of the exchange, finally reacted, his hand lifting to press firmly against Lucas's wrist, fingers tightening just enough to signal restraint, his voice low, controlled. You're crossing a line, he said, but there was no real force behind it, more habit than rejection. Lucas glanced at him, a flicker of amusement returning. Am I? He murmured, but didn't release him. Evan's gaze sharpened slightly, then shifted back to the older man, his tone returning to its usual calm. With all due respect, he said, this is new information to me. As well? Lucas let out a quiet breath, something between a laugh and a sigh. Right, he said, then added casually. I never told you my full name. Evan's eyes narrowed just slightly, the pieces beginning to align. Lucas tilted his head, almost sheepish for half a second. I use my mother's surname, he explained, habit, then shrugged lightly. My father's side is more complicated. Derek scoffed loudly, still trying to regain control of the situation. Complicated? He snapped. You mean non-existent? Lucas didn't even look at him this time, his attention fixed elsewhere. You can call it whatever helps you sleep, he said calmly. The old man finally spoke again, his voice slower now, more measured than before. That's enough, he said, the authority returning instantly, cutting through the tension with ease. This matter isn't something that will be resolved today. His gaze lingered on Lucas, thoughtful, then shifted to Evan, calculating. We'll revisit this properly. Added, standing up with deliberate calm, signaling the end of the discussion. Derek looked like he wanted to argue, his jaw tight, fists clenched, but one glance from the older man was enough to stop him, the frustration still burning but contained. Evan inclined his head slightly, polite as ever. Understood, he said, as if nothing out of the ordinary had just occurred. The room began to empty just as quickly as it had filled, the tension dispersing in controlled silence, until only Evan and Lucas remained standing there. Lucas's grip loosened slightly, but didn't disappear entirely, his gaze dropping briefly to Evan before lifting again. So, he said lightly, as if they weren't standing in the aftermath of a complete power shift. I guess that answers your question. Evan exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable, though there was something sharper beneath the surface now, something newly aware. You're not just a student, he said, and Lucas's smile returned, softer this time. I told you, he replied. You didn't ask. 5 years ago, Lucas said quietly, his voice softer now, pulling Evan fully into the memory. And this time Evan didn't interrupt, because he already knew where this was going, the fragments in his mind aligning piece by piece. It had been the end of the semester, a crowded celebration packed with too many people, too many scents blending into something overwhelming. The air thick with mixed pheromones that pressed against his senses until it became unbearable, his head pounding, his breathing uneven, every instinct telling him to get out. He remembered stepping outside, the cool night air hitting his skin, not enough to fully clear the dizziness, but enough to keep him moving, one step at a time, until he found himself near the bridge just beyond the venue, the distant sound of water below barely cutting through the noise in his head. And then he saw him, a figure standing too close to the edge, still, unmoving, silhouetted against the faint reflection of the river below. And for a split second, Evan didn't think, didn't analyze, just reacted, moving forward quickly, grabbing the boy's arm and pulling him back with more force than necessary, the words leaving his mouth sharp, instinctive. Are you out of your mind? The boy blinked, startled, turning to look at him with wide eyes. And for a second there was confusion there, not despair, not fear, just confusion. Do I look like I'm about to jump? He asked, his voice steady despite the situation, and Evan exhaled sharply, irritation cutting through the haze in his head. You were standing on the edge of a bridge at night, he said flatly. What else was I supposed to assume? The boy tilted his head slightly, glancing down at the water below. It's calming, he said simply. Watching it, Evan stared at him for a moment, then let go of his arm, the tension in his grip easing as he stepped back, Fine, he said. If I misunderstood, then I'll leave you alone. But he didn't move immediately, because something else had already shifted. When he'd grabbed him, something had cut through the noise in his system. A scent, clean, steady, grounding, so different from the overwhelming chaos inside the party that his entire body had reacted before his mind could process it, the pounding in his head easing, the dizziness fading just enough to make him aware of how significant the change was. The boy noticed his hesitation, his gaze sharpening slightly. You don't look well, he said, and Evan frowned, instinctively brushing it off. I'm fine, he replied, but the boy didn't seem convinced, instead stepping closer, not intrusive, just enough that the steady presence remained, the effect immediate, undeniable. They ended up sitting there longer than either of them had planned, the silence not awkward, just quiet, the kind that didn't demand anything. After a while, the boy spoke again, his tone casual but carrying something underneath. I don't have anywhere to go tonight, he said. No money, no phone, he added, glancing at Evan briefly. Can I stay with you for a few days? The request was straightforward, almost blunt, and under normal circumstances, Evan would have refused without hesitation. He didn't involve himself in other people's problems, didn't invite complications into his life. But this wasn't normal. Nothing about this felt normal, not the way. The boy's presence steadied him, not the way his instincts weren't rejecting the situation outright. He studied him for a moment, taking in the details. Young, clearly out of place, but not reckless, not threatening, just lost. 3 days, Evan said finally. The decision made with the same quiet efficiency as everything else. That's it. The boy's expression shifted instantly, relief flashing across his face before settling into something lighter, almost playful. Deal, he said. Those 3 days passed in a way Evan hadn't expected. Quiet, uncomplicated. The boy didn't ask questions, didn't overstep, just existed in the same space with an ease that didn't disrupt anything. And Evan, despite himself, found it tolerable, even comfortable. He didn't ask for details, didn't press for explanations. It wasn't his habit, and the boy didn't offer any. And then, just like that, he was gone. Evan came back to an empty apartment, the space noticeably different in a way he didn't immediately acknowledge. A single note left behind on the table, neat, concise. My family came to take me back. Sorry for leaving without saying goodbye. There was money beside it, more than enough to cover anything he had used. Precise, considerate. Evan had read it once, folded it, and moved on. Or at least, that's what he had told himself. You treated me like a kid back then, Lucas said now, pulling Evan out of the memory, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Evan let out a quiet breath, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. You were a kid, he said. Lucas frowned immediately, mock offense returning. I was not that bad, he protested. Evan huffed softly, shaking his head. You were, he said. I've dealt with enough younger siblings to know the type. Lucas leaned closer slightly, his tone dropping just a fraction. And now? He asked. Evan glanced at him, taking in the difference fully this time. The height, the presence, the confidence, everything that had changed so drastically it was almost difficult to reconcile with the memory. Now you're. He paused, searching for the right word, then shook his head once. Different. Lucas's smile softened, something quieter settling there. Good different? He asked. Evan didn't answer directly, but he didn't deny it either. There was a brief silence before Evan spoke again, more grounded now. So that's when it started? He asked. Lucas nodded slowly. Not fully, he admitted, but it stayed, his gaze steady, unwavering. And then 5 years ago, his expression shifted slightly, more serious now. When everything at home fell apart, he continued. I left. Evan's eyes narrowed just a fraction, already knowing the rest, and ended up finding you again. Lucas finished, a small smile returning. Guess I've always had good instincts. Evan exhaled quietly, leaning back into his seat, the weight of everything settling into something clearer now, something that made more sense than it should have. You disappeared again, he pointed out. Lucas nodded. Grandfather arranged for me to study abroad, he said. Said it would be better for me. A faint pause, then softer. He wasn't wrong. Evan glanced at him briefly. And in those 5 years, he asked. Lucas's expression didn't change, but there was something more focused in his gaze now, something more deliberate. I didn't come back, he said, but I kept track of you. Evan didn't respond, But his attention didn't waver either. I planned to come back after I graduated, Lucas continued. Do things properly. A faint exhale, then quieter. But then I heard about your engagement. His jaw tightened slightly. And I couldn't wait anymore. Evan's gaze shifted forward again. Thoughtful, processing. And the bar? He asked. Lucas's lips curved slightly. If I told you it was coincidence, would you believe me? Evan shook his head faintly. I don't know. Lucas leaned back slightly, his voice softening. Call it timing, he said. Then after a brief pause, added, or call it fate. Evan let out a quiet breath, something lighter slipping through. And if I hadn't heard that conversation? He asked. Lucas didn't hesitate. Then I would have taken you back anyway, he said, calm, certain. I wasn't going to let you stay with him. The conviction in his voice left no room for doubt. The car was quiet after that, the tension from before gone, replaced by something steadier, something easier. Evan didn't speak, but he didn't need to, because for the first time, the presence beside him didn't feel like a variable to analyze, but something he could simply exist with. As the city lights passed by outside, reflected faintly in the window, Evan realized something he hadn't considered before. Not just that Lucas's presence stabilized him physically, but that being near him felt right, in a way that had nothing to do with pheromones at all. He had never thought much about love, never needed to, assuming it was just another function, another step in a structured life, something that would happen when it was required. But now, sitting there in the quiet, with the weight of the past and the present settling into something unexpectedly aligned, he understood, perhaps for the first time, that there might be an exception to that rule, and that exception was sitting right beside him. 5 years ago, Lucas said quietly, his voice softer now, pulling Evan fully into the memory. And this time Evan didn't interrupt, because he already knew where this was going, the fragments in his mind aligning piece by piece. It had been the end of the semester, a crowded celebration packed with too many people, too many scents blending into something overwhelming. The air thick with mixed pheromones that pressed against his senses until it became unbearable, his head pounding, his breathing uneven, every instinct telling him to get out. He remembered stepping outside, the cool night air hitting his skin, not enough to fully clear the dizziness, but enough to keep him moving, one step at a time, until he found himself near the bridge just beyond the venue, the distant sound of water below barely cutting through the noise in his head. And then he saw him, a figure standing too close to the edge, still, unmoving, silhouetted against the faint reflection of the river below. And for a split second, Evan didn't think, didn't analyze, just reacted, moving forward quickly, grabbing the boy's arm and pulling him back with more force than necessary. The words leaving his mouth sharp, instinctive. Are you out of your mind? The boy blinked, startled, turning to look at him with wide eyes. And for a second there was confusion there, not despair, not fear, just confusion. Do I look like I'm about to jump? He asked, his voice steady despite the situation, and Evan exhaled sharply, irritation cutting through the haze in his head. You were standing on the edge of a bridge at night, he said flatly. What else was I supposed to assume? The boy tilted his head slightly, glancing down at the water below. It's calming, he said simply. Watching it, Evan stared at him for a moment, then let go of his arm, the tension in his grip easing as he stepped back. Fine, he said. If I misunderstood, then I'll leave you alone. But he didn't move immediately, because something else had already shifted. When he'd grabbed him, something had cut through the noise in his system, a scent, clean, steady, grounding, so different from the overwhelming chaos inside the party that his entire body had reacted before his mind could process it, the pounding in his head easing, the dizziness fading just enough to make him aware of how significant the change was. The boy noticed his hesitation, his gaze sharpening slightly. You don't look well, he said, and Evan frowned, instinctively brushing it off. I'm fine, he replied, but the boy didn't seem convinced, instead stepping closer, not intrusive, just enough that the steady presence remained, the effect immediate, undeniable. They ended up sitting there longer than either of them had planned, the silence not awkward, just quiet, the kind that didn't demand anything. After a while, the boy spoke again, his tone casual but carrying something underneath. I don't have anywhere to go. Tonight, he said, no money, no phone, he added, glancing at Evan briefly. Can I stay with you for a few days? The request was straightforward, almost blunt, and under normal circumstances, Evan would have refused without hesitation. He didn't involve himself in other people's problems, didn't invite complications into his life. But this wasn't normal. Nothing about this felt normal. Not the way the boy's presence steadied him, not the way his instincts weren't rejecting the situation. Outright. He studied him for a moment, taking in the details. Young, clearly out of place, but not reckless, not threatening, just lost. 3 days. Evan said finally. The decision made with the same quiet efficiency as everything else. That's it. The boy's expression shifted instantly, relief flashing across his face before settling into something lighter, almost playful. Deal, he said. Those 3 days passed in a way Evan hadn't expected. Quiet, uncomplicated. The boy didn't ask questions, didn't overstep, just existed in the same space with an ease that didn't disrupt anything. And Evan, despite himself, found it tolerable, even comfortable. He didn't ask for details, didn't press for explanations. It wasn't his habit, and the boy didn't offer any. And then, just like that, he was gone. Evan came back to an empty apartment, the space noticeably different in a way he didn't immediately acknowledge. A single note left behind on the table. Neat, concise. My family came to take me back. Sorry for leaving without saying goodbye. There was money beside it, more than enough to cover anything he had used. Precise, considerate. Evan had read it once, folded it, and moved on. Or at least, that's what he had told himself. You treated me like a kid back then, Lucas said now, pulling Evan out of the memory, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Evan let out a quiet breath, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. You were a kid, he said. Lucas frowned immediately, mock offense returning. I was not that bad, he protested. Evan huffed softly, shaking his head. You were, he said. I've dealt with enough younger siblings to know the type. Lucas leaned closer slightly, his tone dropping just a fraction. And now? He asked. Evan glanced at him, taking in the difference fully this time. The height, the presence, the confidence. Everything that had changed so drastically it was almost difficult to reconcile with the memory. Now you're. He paused, searching for the right word, then shook his head once. Different. Lucas's smile softened, something quieter settling there. Good different? He asked. Evan didn't answer directly, but he didn't deny it either. There was a brief silence before Evan spoke again, more grounded now. So that's when it started? He asked. Lucas nodded slowly. Not fully, he admitted, but it stayed. His gaze steady, unwavering. And then 5 years ago, his expression shifted slightly. More serious now. When everything at home fell apart, he continued. I left. Evan's eyes narrowed just a fraction, already knowing the rest, and ended up finding you again. Lucas finished, a small smile returning. Guess I've always had good instincts. Evan exhaled quietly, leaning back into his seat, the weight of everything settling into something clearer now. Something that made more sense than it should have. You disappeared. Again, he pointed out. Lucas nodded. Grandfather arranged for me to study abroad. He said it would be better for me. A faint pause, then softer. He wasn't wrong. Evan glanced at him briefly. And in those 5 years, he asked. Lucas's expression didn't change, but there was something more focused in his gaze now, something more deliberate. I didn't come back, he said, but I kept track of you. Evan didn't respond. But his attention didn't waver either. I planned to come back. After I graduated, Lucas continued. Do things properly. A faint exhale, then quieter. But then I heard about your engagement. His jaw tightened slightly. And I couldn't wait anymore. Evan's gaze shifted forward again. Thoughtful, processing. And the bar? He asked. Lucas's lips curved slightly. If I told you it was coincidence, would you believe me? Evan shook his head faintly. I don't know. Lucas leaned back slightly, his voice softening. Call it timing, he said. Then after a brief pause, added, or call it fate. Evan let out a quiet breath, something lighter slipping through. And if I hadn't heard that conversation, he asked. Lucas didn't hesitate. Then I would have taken you back anyway, he said, calm, certain. I wasn't going to let you stay with him. The conviction in his voice left no room for doubt. The car was quiet after that, the tension from before gone, replaced by something steadier, something easier. Evan didn't speak, but he didn't need to, because for the first time, the presence beside him didn't feel like a variable to analyze, but something he could simply exist with. As the city lights passed by outside, reflected faintly in the window, Evan realized something he hadn't considered before. Not just that Lucas's presence stabilized him physically, but that being near him felt right in a way that had nothing to do with pheromones at all. He had never thought much about love, never needed to, assuming it was just another function, another step in a structured life, something that would happen when it was required. But now, sitting there in the quiet, with the weight of the past and the present settling into something unexpectedly aligned, he understood, perhaps for the first time, that there might be an exception to that rule, and that exception was sitting right beside him. "Do you want to come up for a bit?" Evan's voice was steady, but there was a brief hesitation before the words fully formed, subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice, but Lucas did. His eyes lit up immediately, something bright and unmistakably pleased flashing across his expression. "Are you sure?" he asked, already stepping closer, and Evan didn't answer, just turned and headed toward the entrance, which was answer enough. The moment the door closed behind them, the atmosphere shifted, the quiet of the apartment wrapping around them, and Lucas didn't wait this time. Closing the distance in one smooth motion, his arms circling Evan with a familiarity that had already become second nature, his presence warm, insistent, but not overwhelming, just enough to pull Evan out of his usual controlled rhythm. Evan exhaled quietly, not resisting, his hand coming up to steady against Lucas's shoulder as the space between them disappeared. The tension from the day melting away in a way that felt almost too easy, too natural. As if this had already become something routine, something expected. Time blurred again, not chaotic, not overwhelming, just seamless, the kind of closeness that didn't need to be defined to be understood. When it finally settled, the room fell into a quieter stillness, Lucas leaning slightly back just enough to look at Evan properly, his expression carrying that familiar mix of confidence and playful curiosity. "So," he said lightly, voice lower now, "was I better?" Evan's brows drew together slightly, his hand lifting to push against Lucas's wrist as it started to wander again. "Are you still a kid?" he said, tone flat, but lacking its usual bite. "Stop bringing him up." Lucas grinned, completely unbothered. "Fine," he said, though the satisfaction didn't leave his expression. "Just one last question," he added, tilting his head slightly. "Why him?" Evan didn't answer immediately, his gaze shifting away for a second as if sorting through something he hadn't needed to explain before. "It was practical," he said finally. "Business alignment." A brief pause, then more matter of fact, "and I needed stability." Lucas's expression shifted slightly at that, the teasing edge softening into something more focused. "His pheromones?" he asked. Evan nodded once. "They helped," he admitted. "More than suppressants." Lucas's lips pressed together faintly, clearly unimpressed. "And now?" he asked, quieter this time. Evan looked at him then. Really looked, the answer already forming before he spoke it. "Now. Yours are better," he said simply. And for once, Lucas didn't joke, didn't tease, just held his gaze, something deeper settling there. Then, as if the moment had gone on just a second too long, he huffed lightly, the familiar grin returning. "You should just get used to me," he said, leaning in slightly again. "Might as well depend on me instead." Evan didn't respond out loud, but the faint shift in his expression said enough, because somewhere in the back of his mind, the thought had already crossed. This was easier, more natural than it should be. Later that night, after Lucas left, the quiet of the apartment felt different again, not empty, but settled, as if something had shifted permanently. Across the city, Lucas stood in front of his grandfather once more, posture straight, expression calm but resolute, the earlier playfulness gone entirely. "You misjudged him," he said without preamble, and the old man's gaze sharpened slightly. "Explain." Lucas didn't hesitate, laying everything out clearly. The misunderstanding, Derek's behavior, the truth behind the separation. And as he spoke, the older man's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to show that the pieces were being rearranged. When Lucas finished, silence settled between them for a moment before the old man exhaled slowly. "I see," he said, his tone thoughtful now rather than dismissive. "Then that matter will be handled." The implication clear, Derek's version of events no longer holding weight. Lucas didn't react to that, his focus already elsewhere. "I want to marry him," he said instead, direct, unwavering. The old man's gaze snapped back to him, sharper this time. "That wasn't the original plan," he said, and Lucas nodded. "I know," he replied, "but I'm choosing it." There was no hesitation, no negotiation in his voice, just certainty. The old man studied him for a long moment, measuring, weighing. "You understand what you're giving up," he said finally. Lucas's expression didn't change. "I do," he answered, then added, quieter but just as firm, "and I don't care." A brief pause. Then, more deliberately, "My parents made their choices for the sake of business," he continued, "and it didn't end well." His gaze held steady. "I'm not repeating that." The room fell silent again, heavier this time, the weight of past decisions lingering between them. The old man closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, something softer beneath the authority now. "You've grown," he said, almost to himself. Then after a moment, nodded once, decisive. "Very well," he added. "I'll allow it." Lucas exhaled quietly, the tension easing just slightly, but his expression didn't shift into relief, just a small, satisfied calm, as if this had always been the outcome he expected. Back in his apartment, Evan stood by the window, looking out over the city lights, his reflection faint against the glass, his mind quieter than it had been in a long time. And as the memory of Lucas's presence lingered, not just the physical closeness, but the ease, the steadiness, he realized something simple, something undeniable. For the first time, the idea of choosing someone didn't feel like a calculation, and that alone was enough to change everything. Funny, Derek's voice carried across the room before anyone else had a chance to speak. Sharp, loud enough to cut through the quiet hum of conversation, every head in the hall turning almost instantly. "I didn't realize my brother had a habit of stealing what belongs to me." The words landed deliberately, calculated, the kind of statement meant to spread before it could be questioned. The event itself was supposed to be controlled, a formal gathering, investors, partners, key figures from both families. But Derek had chosen his moment well, stepping into the center of attention with a confidence that bordered on reckless, his gaze locking directly onto Evan and Lucas as if daring them to respond. Whispers started immediately, subtle but fast, the kind that traveled quicker than truth ever could. "He's engaged to me," Derek continued, his tone rising just enough to draw more attention. "Or he was," he corrected with a scoff, "until someone decided to climb over family to take what wasn't his." His eyes flicked toward Lucas, accusation clear, venom barely concealed. "And you," he added, turning back to Evan. "I didn't realize you were that. Desperate for a better offer." The implication hung heavy, ugly, designed to stick. The room shifted, tension building, eyes watching, waiting. Lucas didn't move immediately, didn't interrupt, his expression unreadable for a second too long. And then, he stepped forward, not rushed, not aggressive, just precise, controlled, placing himself slightly in front of Evan without making a show of it. His voice calm when he finally spoke. "Are you finished?" The question was simple, almost polite, but it carried something underneath that made the air tighten. Derek let out a sharp laugh. "What? No denial," he shot back. "Or are you just going to stand there and pretend this isn't exactly what it looks like?" Lucas tilted his head slightly, studying him as if the entire outburst was nothing more than an inconvenience. "You're confusing ownership with assumption," he said evenly. "He was never yours to begin with." The words landed clean, without force, but the effect was immediate. Derek's expression twisting, anger flaring again. "Say that again," he snapped, stepping forward. But this time Lucas didn't give him the space to control the moment, his voice cutting in before Derek could continue. Sharper now, colder. "You humiliated him in public," he said, each word deliberate. "You treated him like an obligation instead of a person." A brief pause, then quieter, more pointed. "And now you're surprised he left?" The room had gone almost completely silent, the whispers dying down as attention sharpened, shifting, recalculating. Derek opened his mouth, but no words came out immediately. The narrative slipping just slightly out of his control. That was all Evan needed. He stepped forward. Then, not behind Lucas, not hidden, but beside him, his posture straight, his expression calm in a way that felt almost detached from the tension around them. And when he spoke, his voice didn't rise, didn't need to. "You're mistaken," he said, and the clarity of it cut cleaner than Derek's volume ever had. "I ended the engagement." A pause, just enough to let it settle. "Because I chose to." The room shifted again, more noticeably this time, the direction of attention no longer following Derek. Derek let out a scoff, trying to recover. "Chose? he repeated, incredulous. You think anyone believes that? Evan didn't react, didn't argue, just held his gaze steadily. Believe whatever you want, he said. It doesn't change the outcome. The simplicity of the response stripped the moment of drama, leaving Derek with nothing to push against. Lucas glanced at Evan briefly, something approving flickering in his expression before he looked back at Derek, the faintest hint of a smile returning. If you're looking for sympathy, he added lightly, this isn't the place. Derek's composure cracked then, just enough for it to show, his anger no longer controlled, no longer strategic. You think this is over? He snapped, his voice rising again. You think you can just walk away without consequences? Lucas's expression didn't change, but his tone did, dropping slightly, quieter, more final. It already is, he said. The words hadn't even fully settled before another voice cut in, older, steadier, carrying authority that didn't need to be raised. That's enough. The shift was immediate, the room parting almost instinctively as the older man stepped forward, his presence alone enough to silence what remained of the tension. Derek froze, the anger still there, but suddenly restrained, contained under something heavier. The old man's gaze moved from him to Evan, then to Lucas, assessing, measuring, and when he spoke again, his tone was calm, but final. This matter has already been reviewed, he said, and the decision has been made. Derek's expression tightened, something uneasy flickering beneath the surface. Grandfather, you've embarrassed both yourself and the family. The old man cut him off cleanly, no room for interruption. Effective immediately, you are removed from your current position. The words landed heavier than anything Derek had said all night, the kind of statement that didn't need volume to carry weight. The room shifted again, but this time the whispers were different, sharper, directed elsewhere. Derek went still, the color draining slightly from his face. You can't be serious, he said, but the confidence was gone now, replaced by something closer to disbelief. The old man didn't respond to that, his attention already moving past him. This engagement, he continued, glancing briefly at Evan, was concluded by mutual decision. His gaze sharpened slightly, and will not be misrepresented further. The statement was clear, deliberate, leaving no room for Derek's version of events to survive. Silence followed, heavier this time, final. Derek looked between them, his expression tightening, anger still there but stripped of its power, of its certainty, and for the first time, there was nothing left for him to say that would change anything. Lucas exhaled quietly, the tension leaving his posture as he turned slightly toward Evan, his voice dropping just enough to be heard only by him. You okay? Evan didn't look at him immediately, his gaze still steady, still calm. Then after a second, he nodded once. I'm fine, he said, and this time, it wasn't just a statement. It was the truth. The room began to move again, conversations picking back up, but the focus had shifted entirely, the narrative no longer Derek's to control, and as the weight of it settled, one thing was clear. This wasn't a disruption. It was an ending. You're being suspiciously quiet, Lucas said, glancing at Evan as they stepped out of the car, the night air cool against their skin, the city lights stretching endlessly around them. That usually means you're thinking too much. Evan didn't answer immediately, his gaze lifting slightly as he took in the unfamiliar setting. A private rooftop, high above the city, the kind of place that wasn't easily accessible, quiet. Almost too quiet. You didn't tell me where we were going, he said instead. Lucas smiled faintly, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. If I told you, it wouldn't be a surprise, he replied, reaching out to take Evan's hand before he could step away. The gesture natural now, expected, but there was something different in the way his fingers tightened just slightly, more deliberate than usual. Evan noticed, of course he did, but didn't pull away, letting himself be led forward as the soft glow of lights gradually came into view, subtle at first, then clearer. Warm, golden, arranged with intention rather than excess, lining the edge of the rooftop like a quiet constellation. Evan slowed, just slightly, his gaze shifting from the lights to Lucas, something unspoken forming in the space between them. What is this? He asked, and for once, Lucas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped in front of him, turning fully, his usual ease replaced with something steadier, more grounded, his expression softer, but no less certain. I was going to wait, he said, his voice lower now, stripped of its usual teasing. Do this properly, plan it better. A small breath left him, almost amused at himself. But I realized something, he added, his gaze holding Evan's, unwavering. I don't need perfect timing. The city hummed quietly beneath them, distant, irrelevant, leaving only the two of them in the stillness above it all. Evan didn't interrupt, didn't deflect, just watched him, waiting. Lucas's hand shifted, not letting go, but grounding himself. As he continued, "You don't like uncertainty," he said. "You don't like things that don't make sense." A faint smile touched his lips, softer now. "And I'm probably the least logical decision you've ever made." Evan's lips parted slightly, as if to respond, but Lucas shook his head once, gently stopping him. "Let me finish," he said, and there was no teasing in it this time, just quiet insistence. He took a small step closer, closing the last bit of distance between them. "I've known you longer than you realize," he said. "Not just 5 years," his voice steady, each word deliberate. "And every time I found you again, it felt the same." A brief pause, his expression softening further, "like I was exactly where I was supposed to be." The wind shifted slightly around them, catching the edge of his words, carrying them just enough to make the moment feel suspended, untouched by anything else. "I didn't choose this because it was easy," Lucas continued, "or because it made sense." His grip tightened just slightly. "I chose it because it's you." The simplicity of it landed heavier than anything more elaborate could have. Evan's gaze didn't waver, but something in it shifted, subtle, but undeniable. Lucas let out a quiet breath, then, without breaking eye contact, reached into his coat, pulling out something small, something that caught the light just enough to be noticed, but not enough to overwhelm the moment. He didn't drop to one knee immediately, didn't rush it, just held it there for a second, as if giving Evan the chance to process what was happening before it fully settled. "I'm not asking you because I need you," he said, his voice softer now, but stronger in a way that didn't need volume. "I'm asking because I choose you." And then he did lower himself slightly, not dramatically, not for show, just enough to make the gesture real, intentional. "So," he added, a faint hint of that familiar smile returning, but tempered now, steadier, "stay with me." The words weren't grand, weren't exaggerated, but they carried everything that needed to be said. For a moment, Evan didn't move, didn't speak, the city lights reflecting faintly in his eyes as he looked down. At Lucas, at the certainty in his expression, at the complete absence of doubt. Time stretched, quiet, suspended, until Evan finally exhaled, slow, measured, but different from before, something in it loosening, something in it settling. His hand lifted, not pulling away, but moving forward, closing the small distance between them as his fingers brushed lightly against Lucas's, steady, deliberate. "You're still reckless," he said, his voice calm, but lacking its usual distance, and Lucas's lips curved slightly, like he'd expected that, like he understood what it meant. Evan held his gaze for a second longer, then added, quieter this time, "But I don't mind." And that was all the answer Lucas needed. The tension broke instantly, not in a rush, but in a quiet shift, the kind that changed everything without needing to announce it. And as Lucas stood, closing the distance again, the city continuing on below them, unaware, unchanged, it didn't matter, because up there, in that moment, everything had already been decided. "There's something you should know before we go any further," Evan said quietly, his fingers resting still against the edge of the table, his gaze steady but carrying a rare trace of hesitation, and Lucas immediately noticed, his expression softening as he leaned slightly closer, giving him his full attention. "What is it?" Evan exhaled slowly, choosing his words with the same precision he always had. "My condition," he said. "You already know my gland is damaged." A brief pause, then more directly. "The chances of me getting pregnant are extremely low." The words settled between them, not heavy, not dramatic, just factual, but meaningful. Lucas didn't react right away, didn't interrupt, just watched him, taking it in, and then he smiled, not dismissive, not careless, just warm, certain. "Low doesn't mean impossible," he said simply. Evan's brows drew together slightly. "That's your response?" Lucas shrugged lightly, completely at ease. "If it's low, then we try more," he said, as if it were the most obvious solution in the world, then added, softer this time. "And if it doesn't happen," his gaze held Evan's, steady, unwavering, "then it doesn't matter." A small pause. I'm not marrying you for that. The honesty in his voice left no space for doubt, and for a second, Evan didn't speak, just looked at him. Something quiet settling into place inside him, something final, the ceremony itself was exactly what it needed to be. No excess, no unnecessary spectacle, just clean, elegant, intentional. Sunlight filtered through the open space, soft and warm, the air calm, the atmosphere composed but not rigid, the kind of setting that reflected both of them without needing to say it out loud. Lucas stood at the front, posture relaxed but his attention fixed entirely on the path ahead. And when Evan stepped into view, there was a brief shift in his expression, something softer, something that hadn't been there before, and for once, he didn't try to hide it. Evan walked forward without hesitation, his steps measured, steady, his gaze meeting Lucas's directly, as if everything else around them had already faded into the background. The vows were simple, deliberate, not filled with grand declarations, but with certainty, with choice, with the quiet understanding that neither of them needed to say more than what mattered when it was done. There was no dramatic pause, no overwhelming reaction, just a quiet moment where everything aligned exactly as it should. At the edge of the crowd, Derek stood watching, his expression unreadable, the arrogance that once defined him gone, replaced by something flatter, something distant, and for the first time, he didn't step forward, didn't interrupt, didn't try to reclaim anything, because there was nothing left for him to take. Evan didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him, because there was nothing left to resolve. Some endings didn't need closure, they just needed distance. Months passed in a way that felt almost unfamiliar in its simplicity, the rhythm of their lives settling into something steady, something unforced, and for once, Evan didn't feel the need to analyze it, didn't feel the need to define it, because it worked. And then, 6 months later, everything shifted again. Evan stood in the quiet of their home, the results still in his hand, his expression unreadable for a second too long before he exhaled slowly, the realization settling in. Lucas found him like that, leaning casually against the doorway at first before noticing the stillness, the difference, his expression sharpening immediately. "What happened?" he asked, stepping closer. Evan didn't answer right away, just handed him the test without a word. Lucas blinked once, then again, processing, and then his entire expression changed, something bright, unmistakable breaking through as he looked back up at Evan. "You're serious?" he asked, and Evan nodded once, still calm, but there was something else there now, something quieter, something softer. Lucas let out a short laugh, stepping closer without hesitation, his hands settling at Evan's waist as if grounding himself in the moment. "See," he said, unable to hold back the grin spreading across his face. "What did I tell you?" Evan glanced at him, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. "You said to try more," he replied. Lucas's grin widened immediately, his tone turning playful again. "Familiar." "Exactly," he said, leaning in just slightly. "High-quality alpha," he added, clearly pleased with himself. And this time Evan didn't correct him, didn't push him away, just let the moment settle, the warmth of it, the certainty of it, the quiet realization that what he once thought impossible had simply changed. Outside, the world continued as it always had, but inside, everything was exactly where it was meant to be, not because it was planned, not because it was expected, but because, in the end, they had chosen it, and that was enough.